I hope that people understand the danger and the dire situation that the people of Darfur is currently facing, and that there is a need to speedy intervention to end the suffering, but also save life.
Welcome to Rights and Wrong, a new podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Belkis. A deadly rivalry between two military generals has plunged Sudan into chaos. This power struggle has spilled over into Darfur. In the conflict region west of Sudan's capital, Arab militias have taken advantage of the power vacuum created by the fighting. For almost 4 months now, they've been targeting African communities and tearing families apart. Survivors report execution-style killings. Town after town has burned to the ground. The events echo those of 2 decades ago. Then, more than 300,000, mostly non-Arab civilians died in an ethnic cleansing campaign in Darfur. Today, hundreds of thousands have fled the region to neighboring Chad, many more fear for their lives. Niemat Ahmadi is a survivor of the first cycle of violence in Darfur and the founder of the Darfur Women's Action Group. She has been advocating for peace in the region for the last 2 decades. Niemat, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Belkis. Wille. Belkis is the Associate Director of the Crisis and Conflict Division at Human Rights Watch. She's recently visited Chad and talked to some of the refugees there. Welcome to the show, Belkis.
Thank you so much.
Niemat, maybe let's start with you. You've been very outspoken about what happened 20 years ago in Darfur. You even testified about the atrocities and the use of rape as a weapon of war before the UN Security Council in New York and the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. So how does what is unfolding today compare to what happened then?
Well, unfortunately, what happened 20 years ago was terrible. But what is happening today is worse than what happened 2 decades ago. Back then, there were attacks directed to the remote villages, and people from those villages will flee to come to the towns where other civilians will meet them and help them before international aid agencies can come on board to assist them. Right now, the attacks directed systematically to those cities where civilians from the host community are living, but also it is housing hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons. And as of now, there is no international humanitarian agencies or staff on the ground, as they were all evacuated in the first months of the attack or first months of the war in Sudan. And the Janjaweed or the militias who were attacking people 20 years ago were in horses and camelbacks. But now they grow more sophisticated with more weapon, more money, and technology, and more numbers and training. So they precisely surround cities, isolate the city from outside, any incoming assistance or aid, and preventing people from fleeing.
Niemat, you, because you were so outspoken in 2003, 2004, and also quite active on the ground, had to flee Sudan eventually because there were 2 attacks on your life. You today live in the US, but some of your family members are still in Darfur, and you're also very much in touch with NGOs on the ground. What are they telling you about how targeted these attacks are and how violent they are?
Well, these attacks, how targeted are, they are systematically targeting cities inhabited by the majority of indigenous African tribes who were targeted 20 years ago or singled out for extermination. And precisely when they attack the city, they kill, they rape, and they burn homes and calling people with their names, asking for the specific tribe, from the indigenous African. For example, in Al Junaina, they were publicly saying that now we clear the Junaina or Dar Masalit from the Abid, or the word of Arabic word for slave. And now it's no longer Dar Masalit. This is now Dar Arab, which is now it is the homeland of Arab. So specifically using those statements while escorting people, large masses that fled the city, cross the border to Chad.
What is it really? What's behind this targeting? I mean, is it just an ethnic conflict, or is it not also about resources?
Well, it is about land resources, but it's also replacing the intention. They declare their intention of removing these people from their land and replacing them by Arab businesses. We're just quoting what they are saying. But of course, land is one of the biggest resources. It is a matter of life or death for the people living there. This is the land that they live there for their entire life.
Belkis, maybe this is a good point to bring you in. People have been leaving that land. They have been chased off the land and are now fleeing in droves to Chad, where you've just come from. Many have witnessed family members and neighbors being killed. From the stories that you have gathered, what is your impression of the scale of this latest violence in Darfur?
We spent about 10 days in Adre. This is what is normally a very small town in eastern Chad, on the border with West Darfur, a very short distance, in fact, from the city of El Geneina that Niemat was just mentioning. And that small town has ballooned since mid-June in population. Now you have, at least when we were there, about 180,000 people who had fled the city of El Geneina and other villages in the surrounding areas, very specifically because of the types of attacks that Niemat was just speaking about. And, you know, the scale of horrors, I think is really hard to convey. We interviewed dozens of people while we were there, and you know, every single person we spoke to had instances of torture, killings that had happened to them, to their loved ones. Every single person we spoke to had witnessed the absolutely most horrific types of abuses while they were in the city. Attacks there began on April 24th, and they continued until a mass exodus of people tried to flee on June 15th. And during those weeks, you know, people were victim to, as I mentioned, things like killing, detention, torture. The homes of mostly Masalit and Masalit neighborhoods were burnt to the ground after being looted. People had their belongings taken from them. The few bags that they tried to take with them were stolen by armed forces, both from the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and these allied armed militias that Niemat was mentioning. And, you know, and in addition to all of that, again, we hear numerous instances of rape, women and girls being taken from their homes, the places they were sheltering, and they're on the route to Chad, and were taken by armed forces and raped in many cases repeatedly.
The Rapid Support Forces, just to explain, are one of the two warring parties led by one of the two rivaling generals, and actually are made up by some of the Arab militias that were very much involved in the ethnic cleansing and the genocide 20 years ago, just as an explainer. You're listening to Rights and Wrong, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm joined by human rights defender Niemat Ahmadi and human rights watch Belkis Wille, and we are talking about what is unfolding in Sudan's Darfur region since fighting began this April in Sudan. Belkis, most of the people arriving from Darfur in Chad right now, and have been all this time, women and children. What are some of the stories that they are telling that have stayed with you the most? You have already laid out the general picture of the scale of the violence, the horror of the violence, but there are probably some stories that have really touched you very deeply. If you could maybe give us some examples.
I spoke to one woman who is the wife of a leading Masalit human rights activist. He works with a local organization and has been for many years documenting abuses against the Masalit. And she and her family were in hiding during the period of fighting in El Geneina because they knew that Masalit leaders, Masalit individuals influential in the community, like journalists, lawyers, doctors, and others, were really being hunted down and targeted. So she was in hiding with her family, and armed forces came to the house that she was in because it belonged to the relatives of her husband. A group of armed forces stormed in, about 15 of them, and 4 of them were in uniforms, the uniforms of the RSF. And when they figured out who she was, that she was the wife of this activist, 4 of them attacked her. She described to me how 2 of them pinned her down by her arms, a third gagged a cloth into her mouth so that she couldn't make a noise, and then 3 of them proceeded to gang rape her while they were questioning her about her husband. She woke up hours later, and when she woke up, she realized that she was the only person left alive in that house where she had been sheltering. She was surrounded by the bodies of 4 men from the family that had been staying with her, 2 children and 3 women, all of whom had been riddled with bullet wounds. That's just one example. She then, was wandering the streets trying to find her family, couldn't find anyone, couldn't find food or water, and eventually made it out of the city and to Chad. That's just one story, as you say. I was at the hospital in Adre and interviewed a 7-year-old girl who I was struck by, how with such eloquence and candor, she described to me why she was in the hospital. She had a bullet wound in her foot. Armed forces had attacked the convoy that she was in with her father when they were fleeing the city, trying to get to Chad to safety. They were in a car only with civilians, and these Arab armed forces opened fire on the car. And then when she got out to run, they shot her in the foot. All she was trying to do was stay close to her father. As you said, most people making it to Chad are girls and women and children. And that's because so many men are being targeted and have been killed. But there are also some men who've made it there. I interviewed one man who is a barber in the local market. He's 30 years old, and he was passing through a checkpoint that armed forces had set up in the city. They tried to stop him. He knew that if he was stopped, he may be killed. So he tried to get away. He was shot in the upper thigh and was injured. He then tried to leave the city. And because he was injured, he couldn't run very quickly. He was trying to make it out and on the road to Chad when armed forces, again, the same ones that had opened fire on this 7-year-old girl, opened fire on him and all of the people fleeing with him. And he ended up falling down and then was lying on a pile of other corpses for 3 days. Everyone around him had died, and he lay there for 3 days until the RSF came with diggers and with a group of men that they had been detaining, that they were forcing to dig graves and to operate the diggers to bury people. And it was only then that these men who tried to bury him realized that he was still alive, and he was able to make it to safety.
These are really moving and horrible stories. Thanks for sharing that, Belkis. I think it's important that we get this message out there, that we paint this picture, because this conflict has been completely ignored for the last few months since it started in April, actually. Niemat, Belkis has just been describing that these attacks are targeting the Masalit, so that's a specific ethnic group of African descent. Is your impression from what you're hearing from on the ground that the Arab militias today are trying to finish off what they were unable to finish or to achieve in 2003 and 2005 before a peace agreement was brokered by the US?
Unfortunately, it is clear that from the pattern of the attack that these militias are intending to finish what they have started 20 years ago, because they are attacking and targeting the same tribes that were targeted 20 years ago. Similar tribe, the same cities that are inhabited by the tribes that were attacked 20 years ago, and they are now declaring it and clearly saying that they are clearing the land from the abid, which is the word for a slave, Arabic word for a slave. So unfortunately, it is what it appears that they are intending to finish what they have started, and unfortunately, I don't think what they have started stopped. It was an ongoing, because those who have been forced to flee, they have not been able to go home, and simply because their attackers were not held accountable or apprehended. So it has been going on for all these years, and now they have the opportunity to do it in a large scale when the region is completely isolated. Not only the region, but also the country of Sudan is completely now isolated from the outside world. So they believe that if they can do this without any presence of internationals or any outsiders, so they can do it and get away with it, because there hasn't been accountability for former President al-Bashir. Many other officials from his government who have been indicted by the International Criminal Court, they were not arrested or surrendered. And unfortunately, the Rapid Support Forces, the militia who are systematically killing people, the Arab militias, continue to operate with total immunity.
Yeah, I mean, the Arab militias are working side by side with the Rapid Support Forces, or the Rapid Support Forces are supporting the militias with weapons and money. As you said, a lot of the people who suffered this ethnic cleansing campaign 20 years ago were never able to go home. In fact, they remained in Chad. Like Belkis, before this recent influx, Chad was already home to more than 1 million forcibly displaced people, and over 400,000 of those, I think, were Sudanese refugees. So the people who are coming now are highly traumatized. What services are available to them, and what is actually needed to improve their situation in the camps where they find themselves now and that are already overcrowded, I suppose?
I mean, one thing to note is that the area that they're fleeing to in eastern Chad, and that's not, of course, the only place where people are fleeing. They're also fleeing into South Sudan and other neighboring countries. But in eastern Chad, where the majority have fled to, this is a region of Chad that has almost no electricity, no running water. So already, for vulnerable people, the situation there renders them even more vulnerable. I would also point out that in Adre, where the majority of people currently are, they're not actually in what we would traditionally think of as a camp. They are staying on a patch of land where most of them have are, 4 sticks and a piece of tarp to protect them. And I point this out because at the moment it's rainy season. This means, flash flooding on a regular basis that washes away these temporary shelters that people have set up. And, if, for example, some type of illness were to break out in a setting like this, medical health professionals there told me there's absolutely nothing they would be able to do, for example, to stop something like a cholera outbreak. So the situation is really dire. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is trying as quickly as possible to establish more formal camps in the neighboring area. But for them, a priority is really to move those camps a little bit further from the border, because as long as these people are on the border, they are actually at risk if violence taking place in West Darfur actually spills over across the border into Chad. We visited one of these new camps that UNHCR has set up. There are very few organizations there and present. The organizations that are there are working, 24 hours a day, but what they're able to offer is fairly rudimentary. And I would point out that the humanitarian response for what's happened in Darfur is about 20% funded. And so this means, as one colleague from UNHCR told me, that they're basically operating at a massive deficit, and they don't even have the money to be remotely doing enough to meet the influx of people. The organizations that are there, as I said, are working night and day to try and meet the needs of people, provide them with food, water, basic medical care, but that's at the moment all they can do, and even that is extremely limited.
Yeah. So in short, there's far too little help and assistance and money flowing into the region at the moment. A lot more attention is being paid to the other conflict that is absorbing everybody's attention, which is Ukraine. We'll come to that just now because you live in Ukraine. But what is clear is that people are in a very dire situation with the rainy season coming up and in absolute desperate need of help. You're listening to Right and Wrong, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. My guests today are Niemat Ahmadi, founder of Darfur's Women's Action Group, and Human Rights Watch, Belkis. Wille, we're talking about the growing crisis in Darfur and what it will take to prevent a repeat of the ethnic cleansing that happened in the region 20 years ago. Belkis, as I said, you live in Ukraine. You've conducted extensive research on Russia's war crimes there. Both those conflicts are extremely brutal. How do the two experiences compare?
Of course, it's not about sort of comparing human suffering, as it were. Obviously, the abuses that have been committed here in Ukraine and what Ukrainian civilians have suffered is immense. But I would say what really strikes me as one of the biggest differences is the attention that the conflict is getting. Ukraine, was top of the news when the Russian full-scale invasion occurred last February, but it remains top of the news. And international support for Ukraine has also maintained. I mean, the amount of money that has come to not only Ukraine, but neighboring countries to meet the needs of Ukrainians who have been displaced by this conflict is astounding. It's wonderful and incredible in that it reminds one that, the world can mobilize and provide assistance when it wants to prioritize those in need. And I think in contrast to that, it is really shocking to see how little assistance is being provided to the people of Sudan writ large, the people of Darfur more specifically when it comes to this topic, both there, but then of course in neighboring countries. At the end of the day, in Ukraine, most, if not everyone, does have a roof over their head, has access to water and food and basic medical care, at least if they're able to get away from the frontline areas. In the case of the people that we're describing who fled West Darfur, people who really have witnessed the most immense scale of horrors that, at least I have ever documented in my career at Human Rights Watch. They cross the border and they have absolutely no shelter, barely any water, barely any food, and barely any access to medical care. And yet, we haven't seen any kind of major mobilization from the international community to even begin to meet their needs.
Because if you say that these are things that are worse than what you've ever documented, that is mind-boggling, because I know that you've documented horrific war crimes in Ukraine, amongst others in Kherson. So the scale of the atrocities that are being committed must be enormous, and the plight of the people must be mind-boggling and very, very moving and touching. So Niemat, the lack of attention is a huge problem. But 20 years ago, it was very, very different. There was a big Save Darfur. There was a big Save Darfur campaign at the time. You were even part of this campaign. So how do you explain why there isn't a similar campaign today?
Well, unfortunately, as you said, right now, it seems the situation is really dangerous on the ground today in Darfur, as Belkis has mentioned, and as we all are learning every day about what people are facing and suffering. There hasn't been an international outrage, or at least all the initiatives that have been going on, they have not addressed the issue or dealt with the issue in a way, or deal with it as urgent as it is. And there is no sense of urgency, unfortunately. World leader gathering in Jeddah, they are making it about the generals, unfortunately. It's not about the people. And indeed, the Save Darfur coalition was instrumental and in bringing the attention to the dire situation in Darfur and to mobilize responses from international community, because that was a mass movement of ordinary citizens, people from all walks of life, who demanded one thing, that the international community must stop the genocide in Darfur. And that has drawn a lot of attention, including world leaders have spoken out, and they have authorized the International Commission of Inquiry to go to Darfur. African Union has deployed troops in Darfur. The case of Darfur was referred to the International Criminal Court. But unfortunately today, people are dying in silence in Darfur. And it's expected to increase. And I'm afraid that by the time the war ends, that people will die not in thousands, not in hundreds of thousands, maybe in millions, because right now it's the fourth month to the attack and to the crisis, but there is no aid coming in from outside, and the food that people have stored, it's run out. It's run out right now, and not enough. And then people who are fleeing, they are fled with nothing. Not those who cross the border to Chad, but those who fled their homes inside Darfur, going to other cities that are in their situation than where they have left. And there are several cities that were completely emptied from its population. And right now, those people have nothing. And there's no enough ability to from the local organizations to provide them with what they need.
Yeah, so it doesn't seem to be so unsimilar to what happened 20 years ago. And as you say, people are dying in silence. It's true. I mean, 4 months into the conflict, the international community has yet to respond to this raging violence in Darfur in a meaningful way. So, Niemat, what needs to happen to reinstall stability and sustainable peace in the region? And Belkis, what specific action points would you like to see from international actors like the UN moving forward?
Well, what needs to happen is a robust intervention to protect civilians, because if anyone can be alive, civilian protection must be prioritized. And we have called and demanded and urged the international community that they use atrocity prevention approach that start with civilian protection, opening humanitarian corridor so that they can deliver life-saving assistance. And that will also create an enabling environment to hold those responsible of these crimes accountable and put an end to that immunity. Then at that moment, an enabling environment for peace will be created where people can negotiate peace in good faith. And then after that, the transformation. And I hope that people understand the danger and the dire situation that the people of Darfur is currently facing, and that there is a need to speedy intervention to end the suffering, but also save life.
And Belkis, the international actors, what can they do?
We need to see more action from the United Nations Security Council, which has largely failed to do anything in the face of this conflict. What we need to see, among other things, is that they start to engage more actively, including calling for briefings from the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence, since that's is a key aspect of the types of abuses that we're seeing. But we also need to see the council members take an active role to identify and sanction individuals who are behind this violence and these atrocities. We also need to see the Security Council's members taking a much more active role in supporting the International Criminal Court, which is investigating abuses taking place in Sudan and specifically in Darfur. And that's a call that we make also to the United States, a country that now is providing that same kind of cooperation when it comes specifically to investigations in Ukraine. We're also calling on the Human Rights Council in Geneva to urgently create a mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of grave violations being committed in Darfur and to identify perpetrators and make recommendations on accountability. Finally, as you made the point earlier, Birgit, it's really about mobilization of the international community to bring those resources to bear that we know the international community has. They've demonstrated it on Ukraine. And they should be bringing in organizations who are able to help those fleeing the violence, as best they can with regards to shelter, medical assistance, and the full range of other services that, the world's most vulnerable people are desperately in need of right now.
Right. Just briefly, because we're coming to the end of this podcast, the two of you, in view of so much violence, past and present, and so few resources available for the victims in Darfur, is there anything that gives you hope?
What gives us hope is that in the work of this crisis, when all internationals have evacuated and left our people behind, it is the local-led initiative that were coming together, volunteers, women groups who are coming together to provide assistance for those in need with whatever limited resource that they have. And that is kind of the resilience of the people of Darfur, the resilience of the people of Sudan that give us hope and keep us going every day trying to fight for them.
And that resilience, I think, was really so visible to us in Adre. You had people who had lost absolutely everything. And despite that, one man I interviewed who had owned 2 private clinics, he was actually treating patients in the back of his makeshift tent once he arrived in Adre, providing, whatever medical help he could get, even though he had absolutely no money to purchase medication to give to people. Human rights activists from El Janena, who, had lost their parents, their brothers, their sisters, spent all day going through this makeshift camp setting, documenting abuses that others had suffered to make sure that there is an accurate historical narrative that gets preserved about what happened. And that kind of resilience that Niemat, you were just speaking about, really is what gives me hope with regards to this community, that they will be able to support each other in this incredibly difficult time that the entire community is suffering together.
Yeah, in all my years of war reporting, I've seen the same. People are incredibly resilient, but that does not give the international community an excuse not to step in. Thank you both very much for this conversation, for sharing your experiences, your thoughts, your hopes, and Belkis, the things you documented, which are extremely difficult. I sometimes don't know how you do it without needing a break in between. Niemat, thank you for making the time also and being on this podcast. Hopefully we will see some change and we will see some help coming forward for the people of Darfur.
Thank you for having us, and we hope to see change as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Right and Wrong, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Blair Palmer, Christina Vaganova, and Devin Schwartz. Our engineer is Kosi Okbuli. In next week's episode, we'll discuss the deteriorating conditions of Afghanistan's women, and we'll hear about the forms of resistance they've developed in response. Please join us again then. Goodbye for now.